To get us started today, I actually have a question for you. And so I just want you to think about this question for just a second. And the question is this: have you ever been or felt painted in a corner? Have you ever felt painted in a corner, like you felt like your back was against the wall? Have you ever felt that? You know, like maybe I was thinking this week, maybe there's a financial situation, right? And you have no idea, your back's against the wall. You don't really know where the money's going to come from. I guess many of us, we've probably been there. Or maybe it's a relational situation, or maybe it's a work situation and your boss, your supervisor is or has put pressure on you and you feel like, oh gosh, I feel like I'm painted in a corner here. I feel like my back's against the wall. My guess is that every single one of us, if we thought hard enough, we could probably come up with a specific situation where we felt that way. And so because of the fact that most likely we all would go, yeah, I've been there, I've felt that before, we really do know what it feels like, don't we? Like we can sympathize with those who the backs are against the wall because we've been there. And so it usually when we're in those places, there's stress, right? There's pressure, there's worry, maybe some anxiety. It can be really even heavy at times, right? Well, I start with that this morning because, I just wanted to be really happy. No, but I start with that this morning because the text and story that we're going to jump into this morning, we find someone who's exactly in that spot, whose back is against the wall, feels somewhat painted into a corner, and I think there's some things that we can take from it this morning. If you weren't here last week, we started a new message series called The Departure. A trek requiring true grit, in which what we're doing in this series is we're taking a look at studying the Israelites' departure or Exodus out of Egypt, studying some of the major events throughout this whole story through the book of Exodus, and seeing what we can take from what they went through and bring that into our today, into our 2023, right? In order to gain some grit this year, which again is part of our 2023 vision. And the story that we're going to examine today is about the leader of the departure, Moses, a real key player in this whole thing, but specifically the story we're going to look at is about his birth and the first few years of his life, which became very, very interesting as a result of King Pharaoh. We actually looked at some stuff about King Pharaoh last week as well. Not a great guy, King Pharaoh, all right? He seemed to kind of have a knack for painting people in a corner, putting their backs against the wall. And so we see him do this with Moses' family. And though this is years before the departure, right? Because again, he's just a baby, right? And he's just a little kid. We have to know this part of the story because if without this part of the story, much of the rest of the book of Exodus would have played out quite differently, maybe even not at all, okay? And so I think that there's some keys to grit that I think we can take from this part of the story. And so I'm going to read a little bit of Exodus chapter 2 here in just a second. But before we do that, I'm actually going to include one verse of chapter 1 as well, because it gives us a little bit of context in what we're going to read today. So we're going to look first at Exodus chapter 1, verse 22. It says this. It says, "Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." And so we got to understand this context before we get into our text for today, because right here we see that King Pharaoh paints the Israelite families in a corner, right? He's trying to wipe out anybody, right? Because again, we talked last week that he was in fear, right? He was fearful of being overthrown. And so he's trying to wipe out anybody in the kingdom that would be able to overthrow his power and those kind of things. And so he's trying to kill all of the males who are born. Right? He actually tells, just before this, he tells all the Hebrew midwives that if there's a boy born, you kill him, you can let the girls live, okay? And so with that context, we've got to have that in mind of what happens in this story in chapter 2. So chapter 2, verse 1 says this. It says, "Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman." I'm going to stop there for just a minute. Her name is Jochebed, which is really important because we're going to talk a lot about Jochebed today, okay? She's going to have a lot of things that are going to be relevant to us today in this as well. But it says, then married a Levite woman, Jochebed, became pregnant. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Again, we got to know the context as Pharaoh's trying to kill all of them, okay? So she's hiding him. Verse 3, "But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister, her name is Miriam. We're going to talk about her a little bit today as well, so try to remember that. Her name is Miriam. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying. She felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Again, this is her mom. Okay. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Now, quite interesting story where we indeed see that really all of Moses' family, their back is against the wall here, right? I mean, Pharaoh's basically saying, hey, any male sons born, dead. Their back's against the wall. And so specifically, we see Jochebed, his mom, her back is against the wall. Seeing a few keys from her, I think, in the midst of the story that I think are worth noting and considering, by the way, when our backs are against the wall, because if we're not now, we're probably going to experience that in the future, all right? And so our title this morning is The Departure Protective Custody, which Jochebed essentially has to do with Moses, put him in protective custody with Pharaoh's daughter because of the decree that Pharaoh said to kill all of the male babies. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a couple of keys that I see here to help us, like they helped Jochebed, when we're in a tough spot, which I think, by the way, life is sometimes just one big tough spot. And so I think sometimes what we're going to see today, I think this could be really helpful. All right, and so I'm going to give you a couple points of things to think about. Before we do that, I want to pray. So if you would pray with me. So God, we again pause for a moment and just ask God. We know you're already here with us, but we ask that as we take time to look deeper into this chapter 2 of the book of Exodus and just really this particular story of Moses and Pharaoh's daughter and Jochebed and Miriam, God, that ultimately that you would do something supernatural among us. That it wouldn't just be me up here talking for a while, but you would teach us something, you would mold us, you would shape us, you would change us in some way. God, we don't show up here expecting just to say, hey, that was nice. We come show up and expect you to transform us. So transform us, we pray. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, well, I have one point today with a couple other little parts, a couple other fill-in blanks for you today. So you can write this down. And we're gonna talk about this. If your back's against the wall, consider taking a calculated sacrificial risk. Now, I know some of you who don't like mice hate the fact that I picked that picture, all right? But take a calculated sacrificial risk. Now, what I mean by that, right, and just not rocket science, you get this, right? But what I mean by that is taking a risk that we have carefully considered, like is well thought out, and of course, we've brought God into, because that's important, but does expose us to some level of degree of consequence and risk. However, we still go through with it because it's counterbalanced by a serious possibility of a positive outcome. Honestly, it's what we see actually from Jochebed and Moses' sister. It's kind of the old saying, like, desperate times call for desperate measures. Right? Desperate times call for desperate measures, and so it's a season where maybe you're not playing it safe. Maybe we need to actually take some risks. And actually get this from verse 2, where we see Jochebed go against the king's orders that every Hebrew boy needed to be thrown into. Now, it says in verse 2, it says, when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. And so we see Jochebed, she goes against the king's orders, knowing that if the boy got discovered, she was going to die. Right? If the boy was discovered, she was going to die. She could be killed. And so I would say that she took a calculated sacrificial risk. I mean, if she did nothing, her son was dead, right? But what if she could hide him and they both could live? Desperate times call for desperate measures, not playing it safe, a calculated risk. And so if I can bring back a couple of things that I just mentioned as we started this morning, and maybe your back is against the wall relationally, maybe a calculated sacrificial risk for you, if your back is against the wall relationally, is maybe you finally say yes to that clearing conversation. Maybe you actually say yes to getting together and talking it out. Stop avoiding that conversation. Stop avoiding that person. Stop avoiding the bit of root, I can't even talk. I can't talk. The root of bitterness. Thank you very much. I need more coffee. Maybe less coffee. Not letting that bitterness root, right? Maybe you say yes to the clearance so that bitterness root, like, because all it's doing is diving deeper. Right? So say yes. And so you're like, well, but it's going to be really messy. Yeah, guess what? Can we say that Jochebed, it could have been really messy for her? Right? She took a calculated sacrificial risk. What if you said that you took this risk and the relationship could be salvaged, could be rescued, repaired, restored? And by the way, if you're a Christian in the room, if you're a follower of Jesus, we're called to this. It says in Matthew chapter 5, 23 and 24 says, therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. And so even God is saying, hey, if there's something relationally that's not so, take a calculated sacrificial risk and even, hey, I'm okay waiting for your gift at the altar. Go be reconciled. There's something to that. Or maybe for you, it's a relational risk, and maybe it's time to be vulnerable enough to take the risk to go to counseling. Because again, right, some people, like, my wife was like, why is counseling a risk? And I think counseling is a risk because you got to be vulnerable, right? You got to be vulnerable enough to take the risk to go to counseling, finally take the action. Like, you've been talking about it for months, like, actually take the action, call us up and make the appointment, right? Go and talk and work on you, work on your relationship, try to work it out. Which, by the way, just a quick side note, some of you already know this, but we have a strategic partnership with Michiana Biblical Counseling here in the area that makes it super affordable for counseling. At this point, we tried to make it so in a situation, so Michiana Biblical Counseling does the same thing, tries to make it no excuse to not jump in to try to get counseling. If you need it, do it. If you want information about that, you can talk to me after service or call the church office. We can get you that information. Maybe you need to do that. Maybe you need to take the sacrificial calculated risk of jumping into counseling. Maybe for you, it's at work, and like I mentioned earlier, and your supervisor's putting so much pressure on you, and you feel painted in the corner. Maybe a calculated sacrificial risk for you would be to hire an outside contractor or firm to help out because many hands make light work. Maybe it's the financial situation where you're in a situation where like you have no idea where you're going to pay your electric bill or your gas bill, or you're going to have gas money, or you're going to be able to get groceries, those kind of things. And so you have no idea where the money's going to come from. Maybe a calculated sacrificial risk for you would be to start tithing, meaning giving 10% of your income weekly and monthly to God. And some of you are like, wait, I don't have money and I don't know where it's going to come from, and then I'm supposed to give money away? Yep. Who's excited about that? Because here's the thing about that whole situation is that God can take, folks, our calculated sacrificial risk like he did for Jochebed, right? And with this whole thing with Moses, and ultimately he can take that and he can make money. Do you know that God can make money stretch? He can make money stretch. It happens all the time. I've seen it in my own life. I've heard story after story. So maybe that's it. Maybe you need to take that calculated sacrificial risk. Give money away, gain some credit that way. Look, what I'm trying to get at is that there's value when our backs are against the wall to take this, to really consider and think about a calculated, and I think that's important because I think it's got to be calculated. You can't just make like unhealthy risks, right? But calculated and sacrificial, both of those are important. Calculated and sacrificial risk. I was thinking about my own life this week, and some of you know this part of our story at the Poorman family, but I was thinking back, although I wouldn't say that our backs were against the wall in this situations and circumstances, but I remember when I took my first ministry job at a camp. And I actually went for the interview, and I came back, and I was really feeling like God was calling us. Like, we had to go to this camp. Like, this is what we're supposed to do. But they said that, like, they work on missionary support, so I had to raise half my salary by asking my friends and family for money. And so how many of you can guess how that conversation went when I came home with my wife? I said, hey, I really feel like, and hey, there's this one thing. And she goes, well, we're not going there. I said, yeah, we are. And so, and you know, like, again, like we had one child, and we were going to have more kids. And so, like, oh, I got to provide for a family, all those kind of things. It was a risk. But it was a calculated sacrificial risk. And what we did, we were there for 4 years. We did ministry for 4 years. And every time, month after month after month, we actually had more fundraising than what we needed. I was also thinking about the calculated sacrificial risk of planting this church. Because when I felt the call to plant the church, and then I told my family, my brother-in-law looked at me and he was like, so what are you going to do for money? And I was like, I don't know. God's going to have to figure that out. Again, because this was going to affect my family, my kids who I've got to, right? I have some sort of responsibility to feed them or something, right? I got to put a roof over that and those kind of, I had no idea what was going to happen, but it was a calculated risk. And here's what I've experienced in my life is that when I'm in those situations and I see God in the midst of it, and you actually walk through the calculated and the sacrificial riskness of the risk, God can show up, and in both those situations, it worked. It worked. There's value to taking calculated sacrificial risks. We see it in the text. And actually, beyond just the specific things that just in general in this story, I think there's a couple of keys in this chapter in the book of Exodus that might help us in doing this calculated risk thing. So I'm going to actually have to write these things down. The first of this, it might require, and what I'm labeling possible calculations, it might require, this first one is this, thinking outside the box. You can write that down. Possible calculation might be thinking outside the box. We actually see this in verse 3 of the text. It says in verse 3, it says, but when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. And so Jochebed's mom was like, well, I can't keep doing what I've been doing. Right? Like he got to the point where, like I was just thinking, some of you might have seen Jenna Harmon's baby walking up here in the aisle. There's a point, we were just talking before service about, oh, yep, she's probably getting into everything now, right? There's a point once your kids get old enough that like they're not just a lump anymore, right? And so like, oh, I know that felt insensitive, but it wasn't meant to be, right? But like, right, there was this point, and so like Kinley is at the point where she's walking and moving and all that kind of stuff, and so like you got to understand, like get that picture in your mind. That's kind of what's happening with Jochebed here. It's not just this thing that can be held and be quiet anymore. Like it's hard to hide this baby, and so she's like, so it's like, okay, well I can't keep doing this, and I'm going to put my entire family at risk, or we got to come up with something else, right? We got to keep Moses alive. And so in a poetic sense, what she's going to do is she's like, okay, well, the Pharaoh's got this order. I'm supposed to put him into the Nile and drown him and all that kind of stuff. In a poetic sense, she's like, well, I guess I'm going to kind of put him in the Nile. But then what she does at the same time, she comes up with this ruse to give hope of survival of Moses. And she creates a flotation device, right? For Moses, and she puts him, quote, among the reeds, strategically placing him where he can't float down the stream. I think some people look at this text and they go, well, what kind of mom puts her baby in the water? And they're like, he's going to go to his demise. You know, like she strategically placed him among the reeds so he wouldn't go down the water. And not only that, she knew that like I could place him here and there are going to be women, Egyptian women that are going to come by here and maybe, just maybe, somebody will grab my baby and he won't die. And by the way, it worked. It worked. The idea worked. And so I thought about this week. I thought about, so this is just one story of all the Hebrew women that are in this area. How many of the other women just did what the decree told them to do? How many other women just killed their babies? And yet Jochebed, what she does is she proves that this calculation of, hey, I'm going to take a sacrificial, calculated risk, and she does, and it works out for her. Because Pharaoh's daughter, right, and her attendants come by and see Moses, and it says in verse 6 of the text, it says, she opened it and saw the baby, he was crying, and she felt sorry for him. Jochebed's outside of the box thinking, her calculated risk, it worked. Well, that just kind of ruined the moment. Technology, it's so wonderful. All right. So here's the truth, folks. When our backs are against the wall, we have to take a look at things from a different angle. We got to try to be creative, be a little gritty, if I can say it that way, right? Things may not be as they appear. I mean, so many just went and they killed their babies. We don't have to succumb necessarily to the circumstances that are in front of us. You know, sometimes I was thinking about this week. I think sometimes we as humans you know what something we're really good at? We're really good at wallowing in our circumstances. Like sometimes we're really good at just sticking our head in the sand. But by the way, just a side note, when we wallow in our circumstances and we in our messes and those kind of things, and we just stick our head in the sand, do you know the only thing that does for us is that actually puts us on a mental downward spiral. Whereas, what if? For her, she was thinking, what if I could save my baby? And folks, here's what I want to encourage us today. I want to ask you, what if? What if in your situation, in your circumstance? I actually thought this week of the story of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. Some of you know the story. Read the whole thing on your own time this week. But this kid who, after asking his dad for his inheritance while his dad was still alive, essentially telling his dad, I want you to be dead, takes all of his inheritance, goes and he lives this wild life, this crazy life for a while, and then after all of it comes to an end, he gets to a place where like he has to find a job and he's starting to feed these pigs, and then there's a famine, and because of the famine he has no food, and he's literally getting to the point where he's slopping with pigs, like literally like living among them, and he's like, I don't have any food, but maybe I need to eat what they're eating. By the way, that's a pretty desperate place. Your back's against the wall if you're trying to figure out how to eat pig food, okay? But he gets to this point. And he could have absolutely just wallowed in his circumstances and sat there and then began to eat pig food. But he didn't do that. He actually decided that he was going to do something. It says in verse 14 of Luke 15, it says, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. And then in verse 20, it says, so he got up and went to his father. And I'll tell you the end of the story, right? If you don't know the end of the story, his dad doesn't take him back as a servant. He actually does one better. He puts him right back in the place in the family. And when I thought about that this week, and I thought about this idea of these calculated risks and all that kind of stuff, sometimes, folks, we got to just not sit and wallow in our mess, but we got to get really creative. Let's get creative in our mess, in the circumstances we find ourselves. And this guy, he ended up having to just get really humble, right? It may take some creativity in the situation. Maybe everything isn't as it seems. I think we need to sometimes think outside the box. That, by the way, thinking outside the box could actually be the only barrier to the circumstance we're in. We just got to think a little bit. So that's our first thing, possible calculations, think outside the box. Secondly, might require possible calculation number 2 is perhaps choosing the harder choice. This one is hard. Possible calculation is perhaps choosing the harder choice. I specifically see this in the text with both Miriam, his sister, Moses' sister, and his mom, Jochebed. I want to talk about Miriam first. It says in verse 4, it says that his sister, again, that's Miriam, stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. She just had to kind of watch all this play out. This whole like, oh, is my brother going to, because right, she had the advantage of the fact that she was a female. So she had to watch all this just play out. And so was an Egyptian woman going to come by and save her brother? Was somebody going to care for him, or was he just going to die? She had to just watch. Now, she didn't, I'm sure that had to be so hard, right, to just kind of watch your brother floating and somebody going to come by. And of course, she didn't have much choice in the matter in this whole thing. But she could have, I was just trying to picture it this week. I was thinking, if I'm sitting there and like my brother, many of you know I'm a twin. And so like, if my twin brother is like, if my mom wouldn't do this. She's back there. But like, if she put my brother in the water, like I'm going to go get him. Like if she's going to do that, I'm going to go get him. And so she had this hard choice in the midst of this, and she just had to watch this play out. What a hard choice. But more than that, I see this more so even more in her mom, Jochebed, who hoped for the best by putting him in the water. And it worked out. But more than that, long term, you may not have caught this, long term, she actually had to give Moses up. It says in verse 10, it says, when the child grew older, she, Jochebed, his mom, took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, drew him out of the water. And so though she got to be back with her son for a little while, when he was finished nursing, she in the end had to give him away. Here's my guess as I was pondering this week. My guess is that she probably even had a different name for him than Moses. She had already named him, right? And yet he in some ways became a completely different person. Talk about the harder choice, folks. That's a hard choice. That would have been incredibly difficult. But it was the greater good for Moses, who, by the way, was needed to lead God's people out of the wilderness, or out of Egypt into the wilderness and into the promised land. He couldn't have done that if he was dead. Right? It was the greater good, better than bringing about his death. And so she got him for a little while rather than not at all. What an incredibly hard choice. And so her back was against the wall. She was painted in a corner. She took a calculated risk, choosing the harder choice of losing her son in the long term. Talk about a place of needed grit, resilience, perseverance. Because year after year after year, she would just imagine what her son was like. So, let me relate that to us. Choosing the harder choice might require a calculated risk. For example, going back to some of the threads I was thinking about earlier is maybe, and this might be one of the easier ones, but maybe at work, maybe you do lead that project. Knowing it's going to take some extra work and it's going to probably require you to work on the weekend, but you take on that extra work because you know it's what's needed to move the organization forward. It's what's needed. It'll take things to the next level. Maybe you choose the harder choice when your back's against the wall. Maybe it's choosing to work 2 jobs to make ends meet, which doesn't afford you a whole lot of time to spend with your family at night, but it is what it is. And what is the greater good? By the way, it's better to work 2 jobs than to be evicted. Now, the goal is, right, that the 2-job thing and those kind of things is not a forever. Hopefully, it's only needed for a hard season of your life, but it's better than being evicted. It's better to be out on the streets. It's better than not having food. It's better than a lot of things. How many of you are so excited you came to church today? Maybe it's relationally. And again, as I mentioned earlier, like saying yes to going to counseling. Maybe if you're married and your marriage is a mess, maybe you choose the harder choice and go to counseling again. You go again. You know, like I know that it worked for a little while and things kind of went back. And so you're like, fine, I'm just done. Wait, don't give up. Do the harder thing. Go again. Go again. Work it out. Choose the harder. Maybe it's for you, it's cutting out alcohol in your life because that's just, it's creating negativity over and over in your life, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be the harder choice because no one else in your life chooses to not drink alcohol, and so the reality is it's going to be a harder choice, but maybe you need to take a calculated, sacrificial risk in getting alcohol out of your life, especially if your back's against the wall because of it. By the way, if your back is against the wall because of alcohol, you should stop drinking alcohol. Maybe it's you choosing to be a foster parent and no longer being a family of 2 kids. You decide, you know what, there are a bunch of kids out there who don't have parents or have parents that are not doing really well for them, and I could care for them. Maybe you become a foster parent. Maybe it's not only a foster parent, but maybe you decide to actually, some of you might be in a position where you need to let somebody foster your kids because you're just not in a place to care for them the way you need to. Talking about harder choices. Choosing the harder choice might be what is required in a calculated sacrificial risk. And so I know that some of those things are pretty heavy, but can I just tell you that pastorally, I see those things all the time. And often, what I don't see people choosing the harder choice often, though is the right choice. And so maybe something to consider for you this week is in whatever your thing is. If your back is against the wall right now, the idea would be what can you think outside the box, and do you need to make the harder choice? And let God tell you that, because I don't think that Jochebed could have done this on her own, by the way. Like, she needed the help of God, because I can tell you that because I've got kids, I understand, like, I don't know if I could give them up. I mean, maybe Elijah, but no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I love you, buddy. I love you. He was sassy with me earlier, so I had to kind of joke with him a little bit. I love you, buddy. I love you. But you know what I'm saying? Like, there's just the reality, right? Man, like if our back is against the wall, we might just need to really think outside the box, but we might need to make a harder choice, right? I can't imagine that. And so I was actually thinking, I'm going to wind some things down. Abby's going to come and play. But I was trying to think about like kind of a practical example of this, like this harder choice thing. And so I was thinking about this new craze that's kind of going around right now of ice baths. Have you guys heard about this craze going nuts on ice baths on social media? Like, so like on all over the internet, all over social media, everybody's like doing this ice bath thing and whatever. And athletes have been doing this for a really long time. But there's all this information out there about the health benefits of sitting in an ice bath, which, by the way, I think there's some mental thing too. I might pray for all of you who do ice baths, right? But I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the concept of this because from what I'm told, many of you know that I'm always cold, so I ain't buying into this whole thing. Like, I ain't doing it. I'm not going to get into an ice bath. But from what I'm told, it's really hard to mentally get in because you know it's going to be cold. And even beyond that, like sometimes it's even to the point where it's like when you first get in, it hurts a little bit. There's some pain. But then they say there's all these health benefits, right? They say that it supports immunity and relieves sore muscles and get this, improves mental health. I don't know. I'm thinking, not for me, Jack, no way. But I think you get the connection, right? Though it's hard, it's not easy, there's benefit. It's maybe the greater good. And so I was thinking this week about like, it's what we see in this story with Moses, his mom and his sister. I think sometimes in life, it's actually the right calculated risk to do the harder thing, to go the harder path. And so some of you might need to be, you might be in a position where you need to take a calculated sacrificial risk, and you might need to take the harder path. By the way, it's not in our human nature to take the harder path. We like to take the easy way. So I think there's something to ponder there today because of all those things that I mentioned, you know, all of that whole list, right? I don't think there's a single one of them that would be easy, but indeed may be right. So I think it's something to consider. Possible calculation could be perhaps choosing the harder choice. Maybe not choosing the easy way, but the right way instead. Which is the whole point today. If your back's against the wall, take a calculated sacrificial risk. Something to consider. Something we see, I think, from this text. So with that, I'm going to have you stand.